You walked away thinking nothing would change for them, thinking they would just replace you, distract themselves, find another temporary comfort and continue living the same emotionally immature patterns they had always lived in. But what you did not realize is that your absence did not just create silence in their life, it created a mirror, and in that mirror they are being forced to see parts of themselves they avoided for years. Because your presence once softened their consequences, your love once absorbed their confusion, your patience once covered their fears, and now without you they are standing alone with every unfinished lesson they tried to escape. And this is not punishment, this is growth being activated, because sometimes the only way a soul evolves is when comfort is removed and illusions collapse, and your soulmate, whether they admit it or not, is being pushed into emotional adulthood simply because you stopped over-functioning for their underdevelopment. You stopped explaining what they refused to understand, you stopped begging for clarity, you stopped chasing reassurance, and in that stopping you unknowingly triggered a transformation that feels harsh to them but is necessary for their destiny, because when you were there they could delay responsibility, they could blame timing, stress, trauma, other people, circumstances, but now there is no buffer, no shield, no emotional caretaker absorbing the weight of their unresolved wounds, and they are realizing that love is not something that waits forever while someone stays stagnant. Love is a force that demands alignment, and your withdrawal created that demand. They are waking up in moments of discomfort where your voice echoes not as nostalgia but as truth, remembering the boundaries you tried to set, remembering the standards you tried to communicate, remembering the conversations they dismissed as overreactions. And now those same conversations are replaying with new understanding. Because pain has a way of translating what ego once rejected, and growth is rarely gentle. It feels like loss, it feels like regret, it feels like anxiety at 2 a.m. When distractions are gone and self-awareness creeps in, and this is where their forced maturity begins, because without you smoothing out their chaos they are encountering the direct results of their emotional avoidance, relationships that feel empty because they lack depth, friendships that cannot replace the soul recognition they had with you, achievements that feel hollow because they are not shared with someone who truly saw them. And in that emptiness they are confronting the truth that you were not asking for too much, you were asking for growth, you were asking for emotional presence, you were asking for accountability, and now life itself is asking them for the same things but with harsher consequences, because when a soulmate connection activates, it is not meant to keep both souls comfortable, it is meant to elevate both souls, and sometimes one grows faster, one becomes aware earlier, one chooses healing sooner, and that imbalance creates separation not as failure but as acceleration, because your growth exposed their stagnation, your healing exposed their wounds, your self-respect exposed their immaturity, and instead of rising with you at that time they retreated into familiarity. But familiarity cannot protect them anymore because the universe does not let awakened connections fade without transformation. It either reunites two evolved people or it permanently separates them so each can fulfill a higher calling, and right now your absence is acting like a spiritual boot camp for them, forcing them to sit with emotions they numbed, forcing them to communicate in ways they avoided, forcing them to reflect on patterns they inherited and never questioned, and this process feels unfair to them because they associate growth with loss. They think if they had just kept things as they were they would still have you. But the reality is that the old version of them could never sustain the future you are walking into, and deep down they sense that, they feel that you are expanding, becoming more aligned, more grounded, more powerful in your solitude, and that contrast intensifies their internal pressure, because nothing triggers growth like watching someone you once had access to become everything you underestimated. And this is not about revenge or ego, it is about energetic consequence, because when one soul refuses to evolve in the presence of love, evolution will arrive through absence, and absence is a strict teacher. It removes comfort. It removes reassurance. It removes the illusion that someone will always stay no matter how little effort is given, and your soulmate is learning that emotional security is built, not assumed, that commitment requires vulnerability, not convenience, that communication requires courage, not avoidance, and each realization is uncomfortable because it challenges the identity they hid behind. The strong one who does not need to open up, the independent one who avoids deep conversations, the busy one who prioritizes everything except emotional work. But now those identities feel hollow because the connection they lost exposed how deeply they actually feel, and they are discovering that maturity is not about age or success or external stability. It is about the ability to sit with discomfort without running, to admit fault without defensiveness, to love without control. And your departure became the catalyst for these lessons because you unknowingly demonstrated that love with standards is not negotiable, that presence without reciprocity is self-betrayal, and that sometimes walking away is the most loving act you can do for both souls, because it forces the other to decide whether they will rise or remain where they are. And even if they resist this growth at first, even if they distract themselves or pretend they are unaffected, the pressure is building internally, because awakened connections do not disappear quietly. They echo through experiences, they resurface in comparisons. They challenge complacency, and every time they meet someone new who lacks the depth you carried, they are reminded that real connection requires emotional maturity, and this reminder is shaping them, pushing them, stretching them beyond their comfort zone, and whether reunion is part of your story or not, the transformation is already in motion. Because your soulmate is being forced to grow up not to earn you back but to align with their own higher self, and sometimes the greatest gift you give someone is the realization that they cannot stay who they were and still access the love they lost. So while you focus on your path, healing, expanding, building a life rooted in self-respect and clarity, understand that your silence is not empty, it is instructive, your absence is not passive, it is catalytic, and your growth is not separate from theirs. It is the spark that ignited their evolution, and in ways they may never fully confess, you have become the turning point in their life, the moment they realize that emotional immaturity has consequences, that love requires presence, that depth cannot be faked, and that if they ever want a connection that feels like destiny again, they must first become someone capable of sustaining it, and that realization, as painful as it is the beginning of their true adulthood, and what makes this transformation even more intense for them is that growth is not happening in a clean, inspirational, movie-like way where they suddenly wake up enlightened and ready to fix everything. It is happening in layers of discomfort, in moments where their pride clashes with their regret, in situations where they are forced to communicate clearly because no one else is tolerating their emotional shortcuts the way you once did. And slowly they are understanding that the version of love they offered you was limited not because they did not feel deeply but because they had not yet developed the capacity to sustain depth without fear, and now that fear is surfacing in ways they cannot ignore, because every new interaction exposes what they lacked, every conflict highlights the communication skills they never built, every silence reminds them of how you once tried to reach them and were met with avoidance. And the truth is that your absence has removed their illusion of control. They can no longer assume that someone will stay while they figure things out. They can no longer delay emotional responsibility under the excuse of needing more time, because losing you created a before and after in their life, and in the after they are beginning to see patterns they once justified, like shutting down instead of opening up, like deflecting serious conversations with humor or anger, like prioritizing ego over intimacy, and this awareness feels heavy because it dismantles the story they told themselves about who they were. It confronts them with the reality that they were loved in a way they were not yet equipped to handle, and that realization is humbling in a way nothing else could have been, because when love leaves, it takes the comfort of denial with it, and now they are standing face to face with their own emotional blueprint, recognizing that much of their behavior was rooted in unhealed childhood patterns, unmet needs, fear of vulnerability, fear of abandonment, disguised as independence. And what is happening internally is not just missing you, it is a restructuring of their identity. They are being forced to ask themselves why they reacted the way they did, why commitment felt threatening, why consistency felt suffocating, why depth triggered defensiveness, and these questions are uncomfortable because they require accountability, not blame. And accountability is the doorway to maturity, and even if they are not speaking these realizations out loud, even if they are still maintaining an exterior of indifference, internally there is movement, because soul-level connections do not fade into simple memories, they become benchmarks, they become standards against which all future experiences are measured, and when those experiences fall short, it forces introspection, and introspection is the seed of growth. So while you may think nothing is happening, while you may assume they are unaffected or thriving without reflection, the truth is that transformation often looks quiet from the outside but feels seismic within, because growth is not loud, it is subtle shifts in perspective, it is small moments where they choose to communicate instead of withdraw, it is catching themselves before reacting impulsively, it is feeling emotions fully instead of suppressing them, and these shifts are directly connected to the space you created by leaving, because had you stayed, had you continued tolerating inconsistency, had you continued explaining yourself to someone unwilling to listen deeply, they would have remained comfortable in their immaturity, but your departure disrupted that comfort, it introduced consequence, and consequence is one of the most powerful teachers in life, and now they are learning that love is not guaranteed, that compatibility requires effort, that emotional availability is a skill that must be developed, not assumed. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all is that they cannot expect a mature, evolved partner while remaining emotionally underdeveloped themselves, because you represented a higher standard, you represented growth, awareness, intentionality, and when they lost access to that, it created a gap between who they are and who they need to become to ever experience that level of connection again, and that gap is what is pushing them forward, even if they resist it at times, even if they feel resentment before clarity. Even if they cycle through denial before acceptance, the process is unfolding, because once a soul is exposed to real depth, it cannot fully return to superficial living without feeling the absence of something profound, and that feeling becomes motivation, sometimes slow, sometimes painful, but undeniable, and whether this growth eventually leads them back to you in a healthier form or simply prepares them for a different aligned path, what remains true is that you became the catalyst, the turning point, the moment where their emotional adolescence could no longer continue. Without consequence, and in that sense your role was never small, your impact was never temporary, and your absence was never meaningless. It was the necessary shift that began their evolution into someone more self-aware, more accountable, more emotionally present, and ultimately more capable of sustaining the kind of love they once struggled to honor. And as this process continues, what truly reshapes them is not just the memory of you but the realization of who they were when they had you. Because growth begins the moment a person can no longer blame circumstances and must instead confront character, and your absence has stripped away the distractions that once protected their ego, leaving them alone with the understanding that they were given something rare and responded with hesitation, inconsistency, or emotional distance. And that understanding lingers in quiet moments when the world is no longer loud enough to drown it out, because the soul does not forget what felt aligned. It does not forget the safety of being understood without performance. It does not forget the way you challenged them to communicate clearly, to choose consciously, to love intentionally, and now that they are navigating life without that mirror, they are beginning to see how much of their identity was built around avoidance rather than authenticity. And that recognition is uncomfortable because it forces them to dismantle habits that once felt protective but are now clearly limiting, habits like shutting down instead of expressing fear, like retreating instead of reassuring, like choosing pride over vulnerability, and each time they catch themselves repeating those patterns with someone else, there is a subtle awareness that this is the very behavior that cost them something meaningful, and awareness creates tension, because once you know better you cannot unknow it, and that tension becomes the pressure that molds maturity, slowly reshaping their reactions, slowly encouraging accountability, slowly pushing them to sit in conversations they once would have escaped. And while from the outside it may appear as if they are simply moving on, internally they are recalibrating, because losing you disrupted the illusion that love will wait indefinitely while someone figures themselves out. It showed them that alignment requires readiness, and readiness requires inner work, and that inner work cannot be postponed forever without consequence. So they are being confronted with questions they once ignored, questions about emotional availability, about commitment, about why intimacy triggered fear instead of comfort, and those questions are leading them into deeper reflection about their past, about childhood conditioning, about past heartbreaks they never healed, about narratives they adopted that equated vulnerability with weakness. And as they unpack these layers they begin to understand that what they felt with you was not the problem, it was the unfamiliarity of feeling something so genuine that frightened them, because depth demands responsibility, and responsibility demands growth, and growth demands humility, and humility requires admitting that they were not as emotionally prepared as they believed, and this admission is not easy, especially for someone who built their identity around independence or strength. But it is necessary. Because true adulthood is not about having everything under control, it is about recognizing where you lack control and choosing to improve. And in this way your departure has become a rite of passage for them, a threshold they must cross to become the version of themselves capable of sustaining a soulful bond. And even if they resist this transformation at times, even if they attempt to distract themselves with temporary connections or external achievements, the standard has been set, and it was set by you. Because once someone experiences a connection that challenges them to evolve, superficial dynamics lose their appeal, They feel incomplete, they feel performative, they lack the emotional gravity that once forced introspection, and that comparison keeps pulling them back into self-evaluation, because they cannot recreate what they lost without first recreating themselves, and this is where the true shift occurs, when they stop focusing on how to get you back and start focusing on who they need to become regardless of the outcome. When growth becomes intrinsic rather than strategic, when maturity becomes a personal goal rather than a reaction to loss, and this is the turning point where forced growth becomes chosen growth, where the discomfort that once felt like punishment begins to feel like purpose, and even if your paths never intertwine again in the same way, the transformation remains permanent, because you were the catalyst that interrupted their emotional stagnation. You were the reflection that exposed their potential and their limitations at the same time, and now as they step into situations that require clarity, honesty, and presence, they are responding differently than they once would have, not because they suddenly changed overnight, but because the absence of you created a void that demanded evolution, and evolution, once initiated, does not reverse, it continues unfolding, shaping them into someone more aware, more responsible, more capable of sustaining depth, and whether they ever articulate it or not, there will always be an internal acknowledgement that the moment you chose yourself was the moment they were forced to grow up, and that realization becomes part of their foundation, part of their maturity, part of the adult they are becoming, because sometimes the greatest love story is not about two people staying together, but about one person walking away and unknowingly awakening the other into who they were always meant to be, and as time continues to move forward, what becomes undeniable is that this growth is no longer about the pain of losing you but about the awakening of losing the version of themselves that could not sustain you, because eventually the narrative shifts inside them from, "Why did this end?" to, "Who was I when this ended?" And that shift changes everything, because it transforms regret into responsibility and longing into leadership over their own evolution, and in that space they begin to recognize that you did not abandon them, you outgrew the dynamic. And there is a powerful difference between rejection and redirection, and deep down they know this was redirection, not cruelty, because you communicated, you tried, you showed up, and when your efforts were not met with equal depth you chose alignment over attachment, and that choice has echoed through their life ever since, becoming a quiet standard that now influences how they approach every serious connection, every vulnerable conversation, every moment where they feel the urge to retreat instead of remain present, because now they understand that immaturity has a cost and avoidance creates loss, and this understanding has begun to rewire them in ways they never anticipated. They are learning to pause before reacting, to listen instead of defend, to admit fear instead of masking it with indifference, and these changes are subtle but profound, because maturity is not loud, it is consistent, it is steady. It is the willingness to stay when things feel emotionally intense rather than escaping into comfort, and what once felt overwhelming now feels like necessary work, because your absence removed the illusion that love can survive without evolution, and as they build themselves into someone more emotionally stable, more communicative, more self-aware, there is a bittersweet awareness that this is the version of themselves you were always calling forward, this is the version that could have met you fully, and that realization carries both gratitude and grief. Gratitude because your presence revealed their potential, and grief because timing did not align with readiness, but even that grief becomes part of their growth, because it teaches them that readiness matters, that alignment requires preparation, that love is not only about chemistry but about capacity, and capacity must be built intentionally, and so they continue this internal reconstruction, not to rewrite the past but to transform their future, understanding now that true partnership requires emotional strength, accountability, and humility, and whether fate ever brings your paths together again or not, the impact remains irreversible, because you were not just a chapter in their story, you were the catalyst that forced a turning point, the mirror that refused to distort, the standard that exposed the gap between who they were and who they needed to become, and in that sense your role transcends romance, it becomes evolutionary, because sometimes a soulmate does not arrive to stay forever in the form we expect. Sometimes they arrive to activate growth so powerful that it reshapes destiny itself, and as they step further into adulthood, making decisions with more clarity, expressing themselves with more honesty, choosing partners and paths with more intention, there will always be an unspoken acknowledgement that it was losing you that demanded this transformation, it was your strength that inspired their discipline, it was your boundaries that awakened their responsibility, and it was your courage to walk away that ultimately forced them to grow up, and even if your journey now unfolds separately, the ripple effect of your connection continues expanding through who they are becoming, proving that sometimes the deepest love is not measured by how long two people stay together, but by how profoundly they change because of each other.